So the words I understood in that introduction included sex, homosexuality, and workshop. Whatever else you said about me, I'm going to hope it's true. I'll talk in a little bit about what I do, my relation to video games, new media. I'm also going to plug that workshop in the beginning and at the end because I hear that it's optional if you come. Therefore, I'm going to tell you it's going to be a fun, sexy time, and you should all come because it's just so fun and sexy. The point of the workshop, we're going to do some background here, talk about homosexuality in games, what is homosexuality in games, how do the current examples of games with homosexuality in them use game mechanics, and then in the workshop, we're going to make some of our own games. So we're going to look at assignments that you might have from creative directors, from producers. Think about how you could implement some of these mechanics into those games or how you can make some of your own mechanics. So yeah, and I hear that there are arts and crafts, there are markers for drawing, therefore fun, sexy time. It's of course all about sex and gender, so. But I'll remind you at the end that you should come. So, I am constantly impressed with Scandinavia speaking English. With that said, if I speak too quickly, tell me. So if I've just had caffeine, so if I get really hyper, and really excited about queer issues in games, somebody make a motion at me like slow, calm, okay? Or alternatively, if I say a word that is just really obscure and it seems really important, but you look at your neighbor and you're all like, yeah, I don't know what that means. Let's make some motion for that too. I'm really happy to stop and talk. I teach undergrads literature at the moment. I teach 18-year-olds literature about sex. I'm used to that blank stare that means, I don't know what masochism is. What are you talking about? So, this is a talk about homosexuality in games. Now that you've seen this lovely gay Mario. So, we're going to be talking about the current place of homosexuality in games, mainstream games, the industry, and the gamer community. When we say homosexuality, this is an easy way of saying all LGBT issues. So LGBT, I'm going to look at you, Ulf, when I wonder if that's a thing that people know. Is that an abbreviation you used to?
Bi, gay.
Lesbian, gay, bi, transsexual, or transgender, I suppose, both. So homosexuality is a quick way of saying LGBT, saying queer. Queer is any sexuality that's not just straight, heterosexual. So when I say homosexuality, I'm not always talking about gay men, lesbian couples. I can get really close, wow. This means when we talk about those things that sometimes we're talking about the obvious ways that homosexuality comes up in games, two men kissing. That would be a really obvious way. Sometimes we're talking about the more subtle representations in games. Why are we talking about this? So you guys are the people who make games. You guys are the people who are going to go out and make new games. Indeed, sir. And so it's important that you guys are the ones who think about this. And you don't just want to think about it from a content standpoint, but also from a mechanic standpoint. That is, to the best of my understanding, what you guys do best. That is one of the things that makes games an art. It's not just the story, it's also how the game itself functions. And that's something that I think a lot of society overlooks when they think about what's in a game. So considering the explicit ways that homosexuality is in games, the implicit ways, once we think about those things, you can apply that to lots of stuff. So homosexuality is one thing, gender is another thing. You guys have talked about gender, right? Someone came and talked to you, Ernest Adams came to talk to you, right? So this is a way to think about gender too, race, disabilities, all these things. I have been told that there are many cultural differences I should look out for between America and Sweden. I think race is one of those big ones, as is sexuality. So if you hear me saying things that don't sound relevant in terms of the ways that you think about sexuality or you think about race, keep in mind I'm American. And also keep in mind that should you go on to develop for big companies, your audience, a large part of it is going to be American. So whereas your thought process might be a Swedish one, people in America are thinking very differently about sexuality, gender, and race. And if you come to America, if you come to San Francisco, where I'm from, and you work for a big company, these are things you have to think about too. Okay, and obviously promoting video games as an art form, which I don't have to convince you guys about that. So, who am I? I am a PhD student at Berkeley, which is outside of San Francisco. I specialize in sex and gender and surrealism and new media. That means I write about perversion. I'm writing a paper at the moment about cybersex and Kafka. These things are fun things. So before I joined academia, I was a freelance journalist for lots of publications, The Village Voice, The Economist, Forbes, lots of game sites, writing about sex and gender in video games and online culture. This is really fun. It means that you get to have cybersex for work. It also means that a lot of people hate you. I've written some articles that have gotten me death threats before, written about race and Resident Evil. That actually got me a handwritten letter telling me that I was going to be shot. That was fun. Especially writing about issues of homosexuality can often stir up the game community. Wrote just a blog post about lesbian overtones in Portal, received some nice online death threats that way too. So I'm very used to talking about issues that other people don't want to talk about and people don't like to hear about, which, if you are into those kind of things, are pretty fun. So some things to keep in mind while we talk about these things. There is no such thing as overanalyzing art. I get that a lot. Why are you looking at video games this closely? They're just video games. That's ridiculous. There's no such thing as overanalyzing art. Games obviously are art. Game designers are artists who can make a social difference. So these are the things that you can do when thinking about homosexuality. So what do we mean by homosexuality in games? A couple things. It can be games with explicit homosexual content. Bully, for example, is a game that came out within the last few years that has the possibility of two boys kissing, right? This is a pretty explicit example of content that the developers put into the game. Games with emergent content, so Second Life, everyone's favorite example, though it is now pretty dead. A place where people can go and do their own thing. That game is not gay by design, but it's pretty gay once you get into it. I say that lovingly, of course. So games with secondary elements related to sexuality, gay characters that are minor characters, romance subplots that are queer romance subplots, smaller things. And then games with more subtle implications for the representation of queerness, which is to say games that you don't think are about homosexuality, but they kind of are. Nintendogs is one of my favorite examples of this. Have you guys played Nintendogs? Okay. This is a game that, for some reason, won the hearts of the more hardcore male gaming community, despite it being about adorable puppies. And in this game, this is a side example, right? In this game, you go out and you walk your dog around town, and you meet other people who are doing the same. And almost always it's men who you meet on the street. Now, in San Francisco, there is a culture where if you are a gay man living in the Castro, our particularly gay part of town, you have a small, adorable dog, you walk it around town, and it's a way to meet other guys. It's a way to say, wow, that's a really cute dog. You're pretty cute too. So this is a game that I love for its really quiet, unintentional, perhaps, implications for homosexuality. The current state of homosexuality in games. What is there at the moment in games themselves? Not a lot. There's a wonderful Wikipedia page that someone has put together with lots of time that lists all examples of LGBT characters in games, probably 50 examples. They're all really small and kind of sad. It's this list someone's put so much time into, and it's not very impressive. So minor characters, a lot of NPCs. Some bosses, some sidekicks. It's very rare to be able to play as a queer character. There are some exceptions. We're going to look at those. The meat of what we're going to talk about is looking at games that are exceptions and how they present homosexuality and how they use their mechanics. You often hear this argument that gay people are 10% of the population, so why should we incorporate homosexuality into games? It's only 10% of people. Even if you go with that argument, which I don't think is a fair way of talking about representation, there's certainly not 10% of the content in games. If you think about all of the straight content in games, so that goes for straight sex, but also things as silly as any romance in any game you've ever seen. Mario and Zelda, which are just the tamest examples, those have straight agendas in some ways, right? Like, they're about straightness, even when you're not thinking about it. So 10% of the population, even if you want to call it that, does not get 10% of the content. Homosexuality in the industry. What do you guys think? Is this going to be exciting? There's so many gay people in the industry. So this is another thing you hear people talk about. People want to talk about how once upon a time there was one trans person in the industry and she did really well. A woman named Danielle Barry is usually an example for this. And it's in some ways kind of sad, because when you can only point to a couple people, that proves that there aren't actually very many people who are vocal about that. Brenda Brathwaite, who was running the IGDA board for sex and games, says it very clearly. Our industry is largely composed of straight white guys. That's kind of true. Why be diverse? The more diverse we are, the more diverse our content will be. It's not to say that there aren't gay people in this industry, right? But you don't see them. There's this general idea that things are straight. Jeb Havens, who runs the IGDA SIG for, well, that's a lot of letters, IGDA SIG for LGBT issues, says it's not like there are only a handful of gay people making games, there's no presence in our community, there's no gay face. Okay? Homophobia is perhaps the biggest issue there. Even if there are gay people, even if they're important people in history, the homophobia of our workplaces is kind of amazing. Vincent Gauthier, who's in Ubisoft in Montreal, is talking about the homophobic jokes that get made in workplaces. Even in San Francisco, which is the most accepting city that I know of, I have friends who are lesbians who work in the games industry, and they're just amazed at what it's like to work there, even in San Francisco. One of the big social games companies, and they had a briefing recently that was about how you can't ask people in interviews personal information. And in America, that means you can't ask race, you can't ask religion, and you can't ask gender. And there was this big laughing response from the crowd of these straight white programmers, because they said, if you can't ask gender, if you can't tell, something's wrong. And for us in San Francisco, there are lots of people who are gender queer, who don't look male or female. And the fact that that was really funny is kind of scary. Okay. And the games community. So I wonder if there can be a show of hands who has encountered homophobia on forums or in WoW, have you ever heard a gay joke? Yeah. Have you ever heard someone called gay, which means you suck, right? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is in some ways really normal, but in a way we have to stop and think about. So sites, forums, virtual worlds can be very homophobic. Second Life is one of those exceptions that is a strange sort of exception. Community management sometimes promotes this homophobia. There is the case of the LGBT WoW guild that got told, someone raised a fuss about the fact that they weren't being, that they felt like they shouldn't have to deal with there being an LGBT guild. And Blizzard actually said, that's true. You need to shut down your guild because this game isn't about sexuality and no one should have to deal with your sexuality. Needless to say, there was an uproar from the LGBT community and Blizzard got in a lot of trouble and took back that claim. But the fact that a company like Blizzard that's so big that affects so many people can say that really speaks to the state of things. Why are things like this? That's an important question, but a really big question we can't quite cover right now. Immaturity and insecurity. That's an interesting way to say it, but as a gamer myself, that's kind of offensive too, right? If somebody told me there's homophobia in your industry because you're all immature and insecure, I would not be too happy about that. But that's part of it. Because our industry is so young, because so many people think such negative things about games, right? Ulf, you were showing me this thing in the paper from today, an editorial about how gamers waste time and money, and what are they wasting it on? They're wasting it on World of Warcraft. How awful. When people say that around us, we get really defensive, and we get really insular, and we stay in our communities, and that can shut us off to other people. Yeah, go ahead.
Isn't this a lot about our target audience as well, or at least our historical target audience? Because I mean, games got mainstream pretty recently, and before that, it used to be mostly like pre-college middle class.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this again has to do with perception. We perceive our audience like that. I mean, even in the past, young white male gamers aren't a solid block of people who are all the same. I promise there are gay people in that block too. But when we develop as if we're only targeting young male white players, then we promote an atmosphere in which only young white male players play, which comes up a lot for women's issues too. So, I mean, who are the early gamers? I mean, if you look at something like Lambda Moo, you look at early virtual worlds, there's a lot of queerness in there too. So that's both historically correct and historically complicated. I think in some ways it's too easy of an answer. By the way, if you have questions, thank you for throwing up a hand. Feel free to ask. Also, feel free to challenge. If you disagree, that's almost even better.
I have two questions, if I may, or two things really.
You have to pick one.
Okay. No, I can't. One is about technique. You're
Sure.
staying away from the microphone when you turn towards the screen.
Okay.
Just be aware of
Is that a question?
It's not. No, it's a point. The second question, though, is more. So Blizzard said that we don't want to deal with a kink expression in our game. In what do you call those, guilds?
Yeah.
I don't play WoW. I'm sorry. So with a
You
kink
should be
guild.
sorry.
So what is the argument? Why should they have to? Or I mean.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a virtual world is a place, I was talking to Miriam, your PhD, about this. A virtual world is a place where your manifestation of yourself, where your avatar, is about you as a player, not just about the environment. So there are plenty of other games you can play that aren't virtual worlds, where what kind of character you are gets determined for you. In a virtual world, there are, oh, you're sitting right there, hi. In a virtual world, this is about what you bring to the table and who you are. And WoW, as you were also just saying, is a very social environment and is about the connections you build with other people. And these things, sexuality is important to these things in that it's not just about sleeping with people. It's about your identity and yourself and the kind of connections you make. And telling people that this isn't a game about sex, so they can't be out in this game, shuts down the identity and the community and all of these other things that come along with who you sleep with. Okay. So I promise there are videos later. I see a lot of text, but I promise there are videos of aliens making out with people later. Okay. Did we skip one? Yes. Okay. So this goes with your question, Ulf. Games aren't about sex. Why should sexuality be in games? These are things that you'll often hear in response to talking about these issues. Games for kids shouldn't include sex. It's inappropriate. You know, maybe M for mature games should, but Nintendogs? What are you talking about? This is a game whose target audience is like 12. Gay gamers are maybe 10% of the population. Who cares? They're not the people driving our sales. And these are just games. Stop talking about this, right? You shouldn't read into them. They're meant to be fun, not to be analyzed. You can tell these are things I do not agree with. So, right, we go back to games aren't about sexuality. Everything we produce is about everything, right? So the culture that produces these games, when we make a game, it reflects that culture. So if we make a game with no gay people, what we put out into the world is that our culture is one in which that's not acceptable, in which we don't have a place for these people. I see in the back, you're making a face. Yeah. No, that's good. That's good. No, I mean, I don't mean to punish you. I'm kind of curious. That looked like a face with a response.
Yeah, it's not that. It's just for me personally. Whenever I think of making characters for a game,
yeah,
it's more about like what characters are appropriate for that story. So if my game isn't necessarily about sexuality and like what my characters have sexuality,
yeah,
but rather than something else, then if you feel it very out of place and like very much as if they're a token character when you throw in someone who is necessarily gay.
Totally.
And like their entire character is gay.
Totally.
Is to like fill the quota. So I don't know.
That's a really good point. I mean, we have this thing in America where because we're so into representing everyone equally, you'll get on sitcoms, on television shows, you know, one gay character, one black character, one character in a wheelchair. And I know what you mean. Which is why it's important to think about ways we can do this that aren't as simple as like, here is your flaming gay character. You know, if you think about the ways that straightness comes into games, it might be something tiny. It might be something like mentioning someone's like girlfriend. It might be like your character looks at a girl a certain way, you know, like tiny things. But if they can reflect like same-sex attraction, even in those little ways, that's much more about acceptance than it is to just have like, you know, the guy in the leather Mario suit holding the little pride flag. Do you have any specific examples of when that came up for you?
Separate comes to mind, a character in Dragon Age who also wears leather and speaks of leather, and I think his personal quest is something about leather boots that is constantly flirting with your character regardless of what.
My favorite is Voldo, who is decked out like a sub and serving his master. No, I mean, I think that there are really ways to think about this where that can get incorporated without using the stereotypes. And that's something we're going to look at more in the workshop, which is a fun, sexy time. So, games for kids shouldn't involve sexual content. Yeah, maybe. They might not involve sexual content, but they can involve these small things about sexuality. You know, who's the original audience for the original Zelda games? You know, like people my age played these when they were pretty young. There's straightness in that game. There can be queerness in games too in the same way. Gay gamers are totally a presence. There are multiple community websites that are for gay gamers. I know tons of gay gamers. I'm sure you guys do too. Just because they're silenced by that homophobia, just because everyone's not willing to receive death threats, which is fun, by the way. doesn't mean they're not out there. I'm trying to stay by the mic. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It's this weird phallic thing in front of my face. Games, right? I keep saying this, games are an art form. This, I'm sure to you, sounds like the most obvious statement in the world and kind of insulting that it needs to be said over and over. To so much of the world, this is not an obvious statement. In academia, doing literary analysis, which is about doing something that people don't think is important except us, I talk about doing analysis of video games, and people look at me like I'm crazy. People think this is not an art form, this is not worth studying, but it is. And in order for it to prove itself as art, it needs to think about these issues. It needs to think about the social ramifications of things. And that doesn't mean that you should be designing to please other people, but this is a really crucial moment in convincing others that this art form is worthwhile. And so thinking about what it looks like outside of the community of your players is actually really important. Oh look, Sim's kissing. I'm very serious and academic, but also quite silly, I warn you. Okay, so why you should do this? You guys set the tone for the industry and for the community. You obviously make the games, but if your games involve queer issues, homosexuality, your community will shift around it. If these games aren't the exception, then your community is gonna have to suck it up and stop calling everyone gay, right? If this is a precedent you set, it'll change the industry and it'll change the community. How do you change this? Not by talking like me, but by designing your games differently, even in small ways. And the tools you have are content, but the tools you have are mechanics, the game design itself. And so we're gonna look at some games that involve homosexuality and see how they're doing it and how you can incorporate it. Mass Effect, you all saw the beginning of that lovely video. This is a game that got a lot of negative press in the States when it first came out. We have this lovely thing called Fox News, which is our right-wing news. Note the intense sarcasm, which came out with these amazing reports that this was a game where you could control sex and it involved lesbians, and you could make them do whatever you wanted. Who has played Mass Effect? Can you make them do whatever you want? Because I couldn't make them do whatever I wanted. So this is a thing to keep in mind, perhaps more in the States than here, that the press is very, very sensitive to these things. And what they want is a good story. What they want is not to give your games fair coverage. This is not a game primarily about sexuality. Would you guys agree? This is not a sex game. This is a game about exploration, about making connections, about, storylines. This is not. Do you think this is a game? Would you say in one sentence, Mass Effect is a game about sex? No? You spoke up, person with blonde hair, this is Scandinavia. You spoke up. And now you're getting, I'm like looking at you for nodding, so you nod hard. Okay, not a game about sex, but sex plays a role in the kind of connections you can make with other characters. It's important in some ways, but it's not the focus of the game. Because players can choose their gender, this is what creates those same-sex connections. This is not about it being forced on players, it's because they can pick their gender. And so we're gonna watch 2 videos of the sex scene with Liara, with this horrible, controllable alien lesbian sex scene. But watch out for the differences in these 2 videos. And we're gonna hope the sound works.
Shepard, may I speak with you?
I was just thinking about you.
I have been thinking about you too, and what we are about to face.
I love the
I do not
acting
know
so
what's going
much.
to happen on Ilos. I hope we will stop Saren, of course, but part of me fears we're already too late. There's something I must tell you, in case we fail.
We're not going to fail. I promise.
Please, I am not looking for comfort. Saren might already have the conduit. It is time to be completely honest with each other. These could be our last moments together. Our last chance to show each other how we feel. I want this to be special.
I thought you wanted to wait.
You don't have to do this. Not unless you're sure.
I have never been more sure of anything in my life.
Best
Will you
line.
join with each other? Let our bodies and minds unite.
Tell me what to do.
5 minutes ETA to the Mu relay.
I had better go. Duty calls. You would not want to keep Joker waiting. Shepard, whatever happens on Ilos, I just wanted to say thank you for everything.
Ah, romance.
Bass line in the game too.
What's that?
The dramatic bass line, is that in the
Yeah, it's a sort of heartbeat line in the back. Yeah, Miriam, was that a... You seem to have half a hand. No. Just giggling. This is very serious. One of the things we're going to look at the next scene, was that a hand? Yes.
Actually, I think that blue character, I don't think those actually are women. I heard that they have both genders or no gender.
This is true. Technically, they get around the whole lesbian thing by making this character both genders and bisexual. This is, in theory, an alien character who defies our concept of gender and sexuality. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that's an easy way out of calling this a woman, right? You saw her body. That looks like a woman's body to me. This is technically true and in some ways not true, but that's a good point. Thank you. One of the things I love about this is that because you can customize your character, this main character, his or her last name is always Shepard, so that's who's being referred to. The animations, the cutscenes for this character turn out amazingly badly, like in terms of facial expressions, because they haven't been able to work that out for all of the customizable characters very well. So he just looks so uninterested, you know? He doesn't feel feelings. Okay, so now we're going to look at the female version and see what you think is different.
Shepard, may I speak with you?
I was just thinking about you.
I have been thinking about you too, and what we are about to face.
You get to watch her performance twice.
Happen on Ilos.
Congratulations.
I hope it will stop Saren, of course, but part of me fears we're already too late. There is something I must tell you, in case we fail.
We're not going to fail. I promise.
Please, I am not looking for comfort. Saren might already have the conduit. It is time to be completely honest with each other. These could be our last moments together. Our last chance to show each other how we feel. I want this to be special.
I want this, Liara. I do. But are you sure you're ready?
I have never been more sure of anything in my life. Will you join with me, Shepard? Let our bodies and minds unite.
I thought you'd never ask.
Yeah.
was there.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
okay. Right. Sorry, I didn't mean to make you
No, no.
constantly aware of it.
Yeah, it's okay.
By the goddess, that was incredible, Shepard.
Ready for round two?
5 minutes ETA to the Mew relay.
I had better go. Duty calls. You would not want to keep Joker waiting. Shepard, whatever happens on Ilos, I just wanted to say thank you for everything.
Okay. So what did you guys notice? What looked different? Yeah.
You did choose different alternatives.
Yeah.
In special for the girl, they did choose the more, how is it, evil, not evil, neutral.
Aggressive, that's a good word for it. Yeah. But is that a choice on the part of the designers, or is that a choice on the part of the players? Is it, because those options were available for both genders, but it's the player who chose the more sexual choices, right?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a difference, but interestingly, it's not a difference that the designers made. Anybody else? What did you see that was different? This may be a trick question. Yeah.
I'd say the tone of voice.
Huh.
Even though there were different genders and had different types of voices, I felt like there was like another type of intonation.
And what did that difference do? What was the effect?
I'm not sure what to say there. I think the male one sounded more arrogant.
Ah, interesting.
That was to me at least.
Yeah.
And I think the female voice was somewhat more responding.
Huh. I'm not sure personally if that has to do with an intentional decision so much as because they picked different responses, it might be in there. Okay, one more, go ahead with that.
The female part just felt more naughty. It looked like better sex, but I don't know if you shows other lines or not.
Yeah, I think the dialogue changed because she chose that one line that was, what was it? Something that implied like, let's go at it versus like, yes, I want this, but I'm not sure. But in terms of the sex looking better, those cutscene moments are nearly identical. The moment where you see Liara's hip and then you see Shepard's hip, despite those being sexualized bodies, that's the same shot from the cutscene, regardless of gender or, biological sex. What do you make of that?
Lazy.
Okay. No, that's actually a really valid response. There are ways to, I'll get to you in just one sec. There are ways to read this where you say, this is equality, right? Doesn't matter what gender you pick, you get the same good sex. There are ways to read this that it's laziness. I think that female Shepard is ridiculous. This happens in the most recent Fallout game too, right? If you if you choose to be female, you don't end up with a very feminine character. You end up with a male character who happens to look like a woman. This is, in some ways, a problem with this being able to choose your gender, is that I don't think designers put enough time into how to do that effectively. At the same time, it gives us some form of equality, which is interesting in the sex scene. Yeah, with the hood.
Yeah, I will say that I didn't notice anything different.
Yeah.
They were exactly the same.
Which is why I made you sit through it twice, just so you could feel that feeling of frustration.
But something I reacted on was when she said, you never asked. I don't know if they do say that too, if I wasn't listening.
It's because of the choices they picked in the conversation, but the choices they had were the same, which is interesting.
I can't react to it. And also
Yeah.
this week. Has anyone else did that?
Yeah. Can you give us a real quick version of the
In the beginning,
gender aspect?
You can choose between a man or a female.
Uh-huh. Can you hear him in back? Yeah? Cool.
And it was pretty different between them. It felt kind of sexist in some way. When you picked the male character, you had this girlfriend.
That is interesting. Although I think that the claim here, the laziness accusation, might play into that too, in terms of not needing to come up with something new. You're saying, the guy is always the valiant knight. There's some laziness in there too, but that's interesting. And in addition to sex, gender is something I work a lot with, and I think that there's a whole other talk in there. So I'm going to steer away from it for now, but that's a really interesting point. Okay, so design decisions. They made a Mass Effect to create almost no difference between the two cutscenes. Not to limit player experience by gender, so the player can choose either gender. To make the sexual content explicit, not implicit. They're working under an M rating. Do you guys use the same rating system? What do you do?
The head guy or something like that, the European version, but yeah, we know it.
Okay, yeah. For us, M, you can still get in most major retailers with an M. With an AO rating, adults only, you are screwed. So this is an interesting thing that they sort of walk the line. A lot of more sexually oriented games, you just won't get carried in major stores, which means essentially if you're a console game, you're just gonna fail when you try and sell your game through retailers. So players have the choice whether or not to participate. You have the beginning, you can say, look, I'm not into this, when you choose how you want to respond. And in that way, this sex scene is not forced upon anybody. The sexual content itself is not playable, contrary to Fox News. And the point of the sexuality is to promote the narrative and the connections between people. So these are all interesting ways of making the sexuality less direct. It's not just sort of tacked on there. It really is part of the game and part of the decisions you're making. It's sort of off screen. It's playable, but what you're playing is it's not like Hot Coffee where you're literally, it's not like the Grand Theft Auto Easter egg where you're actually like pressing a button to thrust forward. It's playable, but it's not exactly sex you're playing, even though it's sex that's going on. But that's an interesting example. So next example, The Sims. The Sims is about love and sex explicitly, but it's youth-friendly. It allows players to have characters interact. All characters, regardless of gender, can make the same kind of relations. Love connections are based on continued contact, friendship, and beyond friendship. And the animations of affection and sexual contact are again the same regardless of gender. Interesting. Let's see how that plays out. You thought you got a video, but you were wrong. No, you're not wrong. So before we watch that trailer, the thing you're looking for in that trailer is the fact that this is explicitly a game about making love and sexual connections. The Sims is about a lot of things, but if you see, this is how EA advertised this game. Think about what they're telling you this is a game about by the way this advertisement works.